Welcome, everybody. Today we discuss the impact of high interest rates on investing and the importance of cash flow. The conversation explores strategies to increase cash flow from existing properties, such as building accessory dwelling units, aka ADUs, implementing co-living arrangements, kind of like a rent by the room, and also renting out amenities like pools, driveways, garages, even your own side yard. Right? These are things that you probably haven't thought about, but we want to leverage the desirable locations and seasonal demand to generate higher rental income, which is also a main focus. We also highlight the benefits of thinking creatively and negotiating better terms to increase your cash flow. And we also share a few stories along the way of personal stories that we had that created a win-win for the buyer and the seller. So if you think there's no cash flow in this market, we are here to prove you wrong. Take a listen.
Welcome to the Burn Your Boats podcast. How to create cash flow in 8% climate. And now, your hosts, Clark Lunt and David Shaw.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Burn Your Boats. And David and I have we feel like all these topics are interesting, but this is definitely very timely, David. And you might have heard in the news that the interest rates are high. You heard that yet?
I have heard that news several times, Clark.
It's beating a dead horse, right? So today we're going to talk about ways to be able to continue to grow, continue to invest in a climate right now where the market is telling you potentially you shouldn't invest because the interest rates are just too high. It's just hard to create much income right now where you put an investment down and you're getting a return in the form of, we're going to put quotes around cash flow. Right? We've got some cool ideas. We've got some, you got to think outside the box, David. And that's what this episode is about. It's about thinking outside the box, thinking differently, and ways to be able to create new sources of revenue through potentially what you have or what you can buy. So, David, welcome. How are you doing today, my friend?
I'm doing well. A lot of running around. It's a busy time of year down here in Florida. There's, there's 26, 27 million people in here in the summer months. It's an extra 5 or 6 million. So everything's busy. Everywhere I go is busy. All the restaurants, all the bars, all the beaches, all the car parks, all the roads, all the airports. So it feels that little bit more hectic than normal. But listen, great topic today, Clark, because, let's face it, in a previous podcast, we basically came to the conclusion that the Fed is actively trying to force investors out of the market. And it's done a very good job of it in the sense that, the domestic home buyer is still pretty active. That person is still out there. A lot of people have money, and you talk to a realtor that's like, no, I'm still doing well. Things are taking a little bit longer to sell for sure. Don't get me wrong, but, if properties are priced right, they're in the right location, and they're presented right, they're selling in days. And so, in the classic sense of, survival of the fittest, the homes that might have been overpriced, underpresented in maybe secondary desirable locations, they're taking a bit longer to sell, right? Until the seller gets to the point where they're put it at the right price and it will sell in a day. And so what we're here to talk about is the impact of high interest rates, because let's face it, Clark, we've just come from essentially a 10, 11, 12-year run of interest rates being in and around anywhere between 3.5% and 4.5% for investors.
Right.
For home buyers, have been a full percentage below that. I have a 15-year fixed on a number of my properties at a touch over 2%. So, I have some good interest rates in my world. And so, Clark, this transition from 4% to 8% is, let's face it, it's a financial tsunami in the investor mindset. And so investors at this point are inclined to sit back and say, I'm going to wait I got to wait this all out. One day I'm going to have a better time. I'm going to have a better opportunity to buy at a cheaper price, or I think prices are falling, or, because an 8% interest rate is really, it's a difficult thing to absorb. It's real, it's tangible. You put it into a pro forma, and the property that you were going to make $400 a month in now loses $400 a month.
Right.
So that's pretty real. That's pretty tangible. So that's what this podcast is about here today, is to talk about how do you, if you have been investing for the last 10 years, you've been investing in the softest, brightest, sunniest day that you're likely ever to see in your life. It's less likely you're going to see that territory again anytime soon. And I've got a little bit of a, as we're talking here, a little bit of a cautionary tale here. I recall in 2008 and 2009 and 10 and 11, the US market at that time had prices were significantly down, as we remember. But what a lot of local domestic people who live here in the United States didn't realize at the time, that the US dollar was also on sale internationally. And so if you were looking to invest in the United States, not only were prices down, but the US dollar reached historical lows. And so Canadians had, for the first time in a very long time, reached parity. A Canadian dollar was worth the same as a US dollar, and US real estate was 30 or 40% discounted depending on where you were going. And so there was a tsunami, use that word again, of Canadian investors that came down in 2011 and 12 and 13. And Lord knows, I worked with many of them, selling our properties at the time. So when the US dollar started to strengthen, started to regain its, historical norm value against the Canadian dollar, guess what? The Canadians had gotten used to the fact that a Canadian dollar was worth the same as US dollar. And I heard this hundreds of times, like, yeah, David, I'm going to take my foot off the gas here. I'm going to wait for the Canadian dollar to strengthen. I'm going to wait till they go back to parity. I'm going to wait for the time again where US dollar is worth the same as the Canadian dollar. And so I'm going to hold off investing in US real estate until then. Sounds reasonable, right? Until two things in hindsight become apparent to you. Number one, the US dollar never regained parity with the Canadian dollar in that period of time. And so those people are still waiting. And US housing went on a 11, pick your point, 2009, 2010, 2012, went 11, 12, 13-year bull run that you completely missed because you were worried about this small, I used to be dollar for dollar, and now it's, it's a dollar. Like now I got to spend, $1.07 of my Canadian money. So I've got a 7%. I've got to pay 7% more now. And so that's a cautionary tale as we start out this this conversation today, that interest rates were super low. And the chances are we're not going to see that again. And so for anybody out there saying, we're going to wait till rates come down, they may come down, but they're never going anywhere near what, the market got used to. And you could be waiting a decade, you could be waiting 2 decades, at which time your investable horizon has expired. You're 60 then, and your life's going to be very different. So when rates go from 4% to 8%, Clark, and you put that into a pro forma, it's pretty ugly, right?
It's mind blowing. And, I remember going back a few years ago, and my goal was always to, I could just buy a property, I could fix it up, I could put 20% down. And I was like, do I want to get $500 a month cash flow or like $450, depending on how I do this renovation, right? Like that was it, right? And it was fairly It wasn't very difficult. Almost anything I could buy at that time. And this is not Airbnb. This isn't doing, renting by the room or putting a pool in or doing anything creative. It was just putting up vanilla ice cream, long-term tenant, giving it to a property manager and telling the property manager, do not bother me unless the damn thing catches on fire, right? Well, obviously those times have changed. And, I love that you bring up the point about it getting to be more, I'm going to wait, I'm going to time the market. You're essentially, describing timing the market, right? And I want to give an example as I think about it is that even if the rates drop, right? What's going to happen is everyone's going to run back in and it's going to become very stressful. And so like, I think that right now, I want to give an example. We're driving on these like super skinny roads. I was in Santorini, right? And in Santorini, all the roads, like I can touch the wall on both sides, right? And it's super stressful. And I'm walking down the road and there's like a 50-50 shot the next car is going to take me out, right? So you're not texting when you're walking down the street in Santorini, Greece, right? You're like full focus ahead, right? It's super stressful. And and if you're driving, it's stressful. If you're walking, I don't care what you're doing. When you're going from A to B, it's stressful, right? Then I land in Tampa and I'm driving down the highway and I've got all this room on each side. And it's just like a nice Sunday drive in the park. I feel like I'm driving like a big body 1960s Buick, right? Where I've just got all this room. And if there's anything that breaks down, there's all this room underneath the hood, right? And that is, I feel like how the market is right now. If you were to go buy something, you've got time, you've got the ability to negotiate, you've got people actually are excited to answer your phone call to say I'm a buyer, right? And the minute that anything shifts down on the interest rates, you're going to be on those skinny streets in Europe with your eyes falling out of your head, worrying that you're going to get hit. Everything is super stressful. And that's where the market's going to be. So again, like having that power, having that leverage, having that time, right, to be able to negotiate and say, nah, you know what? I know you counter me back at this. I'm just not going to take it. And then the property just sits there. And then you have the ability to go back to them in 30 days or 45 days and say, hey, remember me? You said it wasn't worth what I offered. The market's kind of seems to be taking my side. So I use that analogy because it sits home with me as you go to a lot of countries in Europe and all the little cobblestone streets are so skinny and it's so stressful to walk and drive and stuff. And then you come back to the nice wide roads here. That's what it is.
Yeah.
So
that's a great analogy. It's a great analogy, Clark, to kind of describe what the last few years of buying has been like. On one level, it's a really nice environment because you go to Europe, you got lovely food and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
But quite frankly, you don't have an awful lot of leverage. You don't have an awful lot of time to think and stuff like that in a frenzied market. And that's what low interest rates do bring. They bring a frenzied environment. So while prices are going up, it's also frenzied. But so where are we now? Interest rates are 8%. Where are we now? How do we grow our wealth in today's environment? Because let's face it, Clark, everybody out there faces and approaches real estate from a cash flow perspective first and foremost, right? And but our podcast is about creating, life-altering wealth and liberating cash flow that covers all of your expenses. That's the goal. That's why we burn our boats, right? And burn our boats in that scenario represents thinking differently, taking action, moving forward with no sense of retreat. So with everybody focusing on cash flow, interest rates go to 8%, cash flow's dead. That means you're out, right? The game's up, right? So I'm just going to sit on the sidelines. I'm going to, take a break. I'm going to wait for interest rates to come back down again. I'm going to wait for prices to fall. But if anything can be learned from the last 2 or 3 years, is interest rates have been high now for nearly 2+ years, right? And they may remain high-ish at least for another 2 or 3 years. They may remain stable for the next 10 years. We just don't know. But what we have seen is sellers largely are not capitulating. on prices yet. So if you're sitting on the sidelines being patient, I hope you've got the patience of a saint, because while there are buying opportunities out there, to your point, some houses are sitting on the market a little bit longer, and more negotiable at the moment, Clark. But that doesn't take away from the fact that what I said earlier, if they're really well presented, they're well priced, and they're in the right location, they're gone. You're still in that market right now. So everybody focuses on cash flow. The entire strategy of the Fed has been, in my view, to get investors out of the market and cool inflation, right? But life-altering wealth and cash flow is what the goal is long term. We don't invest in real estate for cash flow today. It's not how it works. So there's no part of making an investment in a real estate deal that's rewarding in the short term, right? So in the first few years, Clark, talk to me, what cash flow is really about. Why do people want this cash flow? And we're going to talk about how to get it in a minute. But why is cash flow to your average person so important upfront? Can you tell me about what is really going on in the psychology of investors that they put such an emphasis on cash flow the day they buy a property?
And I'm excited to give some cool examples to be able to get some cash flow, right? Because I think ultimately we have a problem, and that is high interest rates, which are eliminating cash flow, right? And I worked for my parents for 10 years, and I'd always come, my dad ran everything, and I'd come to my dad with the problem and say, hey dad, we got a problem with, this job or Mrs. Jones, whatever. And he's like, okay, great. So you have a problem. So what are 2 solutions that you have? And I'm like, well, he'd be like, you need to leave, go find 2 solutions, and then come back, right? So I think that's what this podcast is about, is like, we're identifying the problem, and then we're going to give you some solutions. However, with that being said, the bigger thing to think about in this is that cash flow, and I'm going to read this verbatim. This is from David Green at Bigger Pockets. And I love this saying that he said, is that cash flow is a defensive metric. It is not designed to make you money or give you financial freedom. The only purpose of cash flow is to ensure the security of your property long enough to generate wealth. Okay. Now I'm going to add a little caveat to that to say that cash flow is a defensive metric. It's not designed to make you money for probably the first 4 to 5 years. Okay. But then it starts to hit a tipping point. And I'm seeing it with a lot of my properties where they're cash flowing $100 and then $200 and then $225. But by about 4 or 5 years into it, things start to get better. Flippers come in and make the neighborhood nicer. There's a nice grocery store that moves in down the road. Some tipping point happens where now that neighborhood kind of becomes cool. It becomes maybe trendy or something like that. It just moves up a class. If it's a C class, maybe it's a B class, or if it's a B class, it becomes an A class, right? And so for the first 4 to 5 years, it is a bit of a defensive metric, meaning that it's there to just cover your costs, right? It's just there to cover your mortgage payment. It's there to cover your property manager fee. It's there to cover when the faucet breaks, right? And that's kind of where its purpose is to do. But if you hold it long enough, if you delay your gratification, if you're not trying to time the market and sell it at the top and then go do something else with that money, guess what happens, David? 4 or 5 years in, you start to get more meaningful cash flow, maybe up to $500, $600, $700. And that starts to become meaningful because in a year 10, it's $1,000 more. $1,000 more, right? And oh, by the way, you're paying your principal down, you're getting tax benefit, all the things that we've talked about many times. So that in itself is where it starts to become more life altering. Okay. So talk to us a little bit, David, about you need to have that mentality. It's so important, is that this is not about year 1. It's not about year 2. It's about protecting that asset where you're not constantly pulling out of your own pocket.
Yeah. If you want money now, if you want to look to invest right now and you want to put your money where you're going to get a monthly return into your bank account, your choices right now are going to be, to buy a CD, 5% maybe. Okay. So are you really making 5%? Well, let's say that 5% represents $100, just to make it simple, $100 payment over the whole year well, you're going to get taxed 30% on that. Thereabouts. We're not accountants, so talk to your accountant about that. But you're going to get taxed $30 of your $100. And then inflation at the moment is, if you're in the store, inflation is running at least 4%, regardless of what the big numbers tell you. And so that has a pretty profound impact over 1 or 2 or 3 years. So, we don't believe that, buying a CD as a defensive measure right now over buying, let's say, a negative cash flow property is the true picture, right? So when we are looking to buy real estate now, and during this whole process, and it's not just me, it's a lot of investors that I know, they're approaching this high interest rate environment with 2 different mindsets. Number one, they are looking at what they currently have. And how can you look at that stuff differently, right? So if you already have, let's say, a primary home, or you already have a primary home and a number of rentals, okay? A lot of investors I know right now are saying, okay, what can I do with what I have already without me having to buy anything new? How can I drive cash flow, right? And this is pretty profound, right? Because once you start looking at it, because we're all lazy in a low interest rate environment, we're just, money's flowing, we're all just buying new assets. But in a high interest rate environment where you don't really want to buy anything new, how do you drive higher income from what you have? Now, we have used almost all of these strategies. So let us get started. First and foremost, I'm just going to throw around numbers. Let's say your portfolio is throwing off $7,000 a month in its current form net after all expenses, right? You got to, let's say that's your number, right? By looking at your current portfolio differently, you might be able to throw off $12,000 a month. And let's go through a few of these. Number one, do you have an ADU potential in the back of your house? Do you have a garage? Or in the back of one of your rentals? Is there a garage there? Is there a half built out suite of some sort? Is there a alleyway where you can build an ADU? So if you have one rental on your property, let's say it's a 3-bed, 2-bath, for like $120,000, you can build an additional 2-bed, 2-bath in the backyard. You didn't have to buy any land. You don't have to pay any more taxes. You've just built out this additional rental unit, which can double your cash flow. So now your cash flow on that unit was, these are round numbers. Let's say your cash flow was $300 a month. Now you build this ADU and your cash flow is now $1,000 a month. And we are having those kind of returns on our ADUs when we put them in existing homes. So right off the bat, do you have a garage or space in the back or side or the front of your property where you can build or renovate or somehow create another living space on your primary home or on any of your rentals? Because that's a super low-hanging fruit. Clark, co-living, pad split. You spend a lot of time looking into buying houses that have way more bedrooms than normal so that you could put individual renters in rooms rather than renting it out to just one family. Talk to me about pad split and co-living, Clark.
Yeah, it's pad split is basically just kind of formalized. If you're not familiar with it, it's pad split. And there's other companies that do it well too, where they essentially manage per room. It's also house hacking. People have been doing it for a long time, just renting out by the room, co-living. It's not rocket science. Pad split has kind of come in and helped maybe add bedrooms where normally you wouldn't add bedrooms, where they're taking out living rooms, they're taking out like common area spaces and turning them into bedrooms. So it's essentially like a kitchen, a bathroom, or a few bathrooms, and then a ton of rooms, right? So it's a little bit wonky, but you're able to get cash flow, right? Which is the whole point of why we're having this episode. And you're able to charge more money than if you would. So I'll give you a quick example. We've got one right now. We looked at the long-term rent. It was going to be like $3,000 if we were just going to put a long-term tenant in, as we call it, our kind of our vanilla ice cream. And the total amount that we were going to be able to get if we rented out all the rooms and added the rooms we needed was going to be like close to $6,000. So it was a huge difference in the cash flow that we were going to get. So that's something that is pretty valuable, right? But it takes more. You've got to stage it. You've got to put the right type of locks on it with the push pad. You've got to make sure there's a vent, an AC vent in every room. You got to make sure there's a refrigerator. Look, guys, this isn't free, right? This isn't like, oh, I have to do the exact same amount of effort and do something different. Like, you actually have to do some work. You have to think about it. You have to run some numbers. You have to make an effort, right? And so that's what this episode is about, is there are strategies you can do. Pad split, you can Airbnb it again, but you're adding a little bit more risk. You're putting more time and energy. The question is, are you willing to do that, right? But if you're willing to do these things to be able to put your name on an asset, start the compounding, guess what? The guy that's sitting at the beach isn't learning how to do pad split. Okay, the guy that's sitting at the beach isn't learning the market demographics for the Airbnb tenants that are coming in to stay in their property. So all of that information you're getting, you're learning, you're getting training, right? You're getting better prepared for the next property that you buy and the next one, right? Every time you sit on the beach, you know, it's a beautiful day outside, you're getting a better tan. I know that when I'm setting up pad splits, my tan sucks, and when I'm on the beach, my tan is much better. But ultimately, I really grow.
Let me summarize that real quick. So if you have let's say a larger home, that's, let's say, a 4-bed home, you're renting it for $2,600 a month, right? So your lease is up for renewal, and you look at, maybe it's got a family room, maybe it's got a study, maybe it's got this, that, and the other, and you convert all of these rooms. So if you've gotten from a 4-bed into maybe a 6 or 7-bed, which is typically what pad split do. Now, who's renting this stuff is, I know this a lot, is travel nurses. People like that. And it's very common in this shared economy world. So we all think, oh, who's these bums on that are couch surfing. It's actually not that at all. It's people who are in town for 2 months or 3 months. They don't want to have a rental, and they can't afford an Airbnb. An Airbnb for 2 or 3 months down here in Florida is going to be $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month. Long-term rental is going to be, furniture and all that kind of stuff. So these are furnished rooms, and typically they can be rented for, let's say, $200 a month. So for about $800 a month, they can go, and they're in it's rated environment. So they go to a home, they know already what they're getting, and they're very comfortable with it. So this isn't some novel, crazy idea. This is a very well thought out, and it's a very easy to manage type of process. And so your cash flow might go from, let's say you had the 4-bed that's rented for $2,600, your cash flow is $300 a month. But then you convert it over to a pad split, your cash flow with this extra, so now you're renting it for $6,200. Now, obviously, you've got a few different additional costs, but your mortgage is the same, your insurance is the same, all this other stuff is the same. But all of a sudden now, instead of making $300 a month, you're making $2,600 a month in cash flow, in free cash flow. And that's the difference. And so if you convert some of your larger investments over to pad splits and other models like that, that's like adding 10 extra rentals to your portfolio. So we implore you, if you're looking at your existing inventory, look at stuff like that. We're going to run fast through this because there's a lot of them. Do you know, if you got a pool in your house, you can just put a fence up and rent your pool every Saturday and Sunday if you're not using it. Families will come over and they'll pay you, $300, $400, $500 for 6 hours by your pool. Did you know that? And so we see people using that really effectively. Or you've got any other amenity at your house or on one of your rentals where you can separate that, rent it by the hour, something along those lines. Pool homes. It sounds crazy, but I know people who are generating an extra $2,000 or $3,000 a month from an existing property, renting out their pool. Right? You can obviously take your existing properties and Airbnb them, right? Don't believe the hype about Airbnb bust or any of that kind of stuff. What the Airbnb bust is talking about is people who are, not committed to Airbnb. They don't have the time. They don't have the knowledge. They don't have the patience to learn it and understand it. But I have Airbnbs, and they are very successful, and they continue to be absolute star performers in terms of cash flow. And they can fundamentally change your whole underwriting dynamic.
Tell the story. If you're not watching this on YouTube, you can't see you, but you've had to move your studio about 2 or 3 times because you keep getting booted out by your Airbnb tenants. Give the listeners 30 seconds as to you've done multiple things here where you had just an old garage, right? And then you converted it. So to tell the story and tell us why we're not staring at your nice studio that you have and you're sitting somewhere else.
Look, we're talking about cash flow, and I am a cash flow junkie, right? And I do it for fun, quite frankly. I genuinely think cash flow and generating cash flow is so wonderful, and when you can make something out of nothing. And so for 13 years, I had a garage in the back of my house. And about 2 or 3 years ago, or actually, what I'm saying 2 years ago, but maybe a year and a half ago, I had possums in it. Literally, the possums living in my garage. Yeah. And I had to go and trap the possums. And I've got a whole possum story there if you want, but this is not about possums. But I had to go and trap a family of possums and try and get them reunited in a favorable place for possums, which was easier said than done. But I got the possums out, and I was like, we need to do something with that garage. Just possums living there. And so we converted it into a 1-bedroom apartment. And it's right by the pool in the back of our house. And so we were using it, and then we were sitting there one day. We said, like, what would be like a make us rent it price? Like, make me rent it, right? And so we took some nice photographs of it. It is lovely.
Yeah, it is very nice.
And we built like a little screen that we could pull back to provide absolute, privacy to the people who would rent it. And we put it on at a stupid number, like an absolutely stupid number, to see
what was the stupid number? I like to get specific. So what's a stupid number in your world, David?
I've rented it out, let's say in the last month, I've rented it for around 21 days. And it's brought in over $8,500
for a garage.
21 nights for a garage that was sitting there with possums in it. $8,500. Now my family's monthly expenses are somewhere around 13,000, right? And so that is like 50% of my entire expense. Now I have to pay, I don't have an employer, so I have to pay my own health insurance. I have to pay my own car insurance. I have to pay my own phone. I have to pay my own everything. I can't expense anything out that way. And so if you have a pool and you're not using it very much, and there's a garage or a pool home near it, it is mind blowing. Really, it is mind blowing. I have somebody down there right now, and do you know what's really nice about it, Clark? It's kind of funny money. If you go out and you earn money, with your blood, sweat, and tears, you're emotionally attached to that money. And if you own rental properties and every single month rent is coming in, you have a different relationship with that money. But this is different money again. This is genuinely money for nothing, in a sense that it's during the week. We don't use it, right? We're running around our lives, and these people come in, they stay, they love it, and they stay a few nights and off they go, and they're paying us $400 or $500 a night to use literally my garage and my pool, and I'm completely fine with that. And it's just eye-opening. It's more we kind of did it to see if it would play out, and it's mind-blowing because it then makes you think about, well, what if you're looking at a $3 or $4 million home, let's say in your neighborhood, they say, I can't afford that. Well, is there, number one, if you lived in it, is there one or two other, buildings on or near your property that you could rent out, that all of a sudden you can actually go and live in that $3 million or $4 million house that you previously would have said, no, the property taxes are too high, the mortgage would be too high. Of course, nobody wants to sign up for that. But what if 2 little units out the back could be rented, and all of a sudden, instead of affording a $800,000 house, you could afford a $2.2 million house, because you're thinking differently and you're looking at this differently. So if you have you have to live somewhere desirable. There's no point in nobody's going to pay you stupid money to live in the outer suburbs of a nondescript place. You have to live somewhere, I guess, where people go. And Florida, unfortunately for us, in the high season is over to the point of the start of the call. It's just oversubscribed at this time of the year. So look, if you are looking at anything, if you own a property that is anywhere desirable near mountains, rivers, lakes, don't underestimate that people will, or a city, don't underestimate, and you have like an extra space in the back of your house, and you say, who'd rent it? Nobody'd rent that. Try me. Go do it. Put the furniture in there. Go do it and see what happens. And I use, platforms like Verbo and Airbnb to do that, right? So look, if you have any kind of seasonable environment where you live, right? So, talking to a lady just today, lives in Michigan. She's the one downstairs. And so she lives in a very desirable part of Michigan, and they have like 17 weeks or so, or 16 weeks in the summer, where the market flows to them at that time of the year. And, she saw what we were doing. She was, oh my God, this is like, I could totally do this in my own house. So I never thought about this. Like, I have this, and we have a garage. I was like, well, if, for those 17 weeks of the year, if you're not doing it, you're missing out on that. And she was scratching her head, and she's in real estate. She's like, oh my God, we're totally going to revisit what we could do even in their own house, right? So look, you can do anything seasonable. If you live in somewhere where it has high levels of seasonal demand, and you have even just a part of your property that's not built on, think about building an ADU on. Think about rolling on a tiny home. Do you know, I have friends of mine who live in a desirable location, and they've rolled on a tiny home onto their driveway, right? And their driveway has a very picturesque view. And as well as that tiny home, they have a casita, a little 1-bedroom property. So, and that's before you get to their house, go through the gate, and, tiny home on one side, casita on the other. That tiny home and that casita pay the entire living expenses of a large, very desirable pool home for them. And so if you're not thinking like that, or if you're not seeing those things, please think about it again. Roll on a tiny home, build a small casita. This stuff can be super powerful, and don't blow it off as if it's nothing. It is genuinely a very powerful thing. If you can derive 15, let's say, a casita and a tiny home, those two things can throw off $12,000, $13,000 a month. That can support a $2.5 million house easily, right? So build a vacation home in your yard, rent your pool, right? Rent a driveway. I have bought a house quite recently that has a 50-foot driveway, and I just put a little fence on one side of it so that I could rent it as an RV storage, right? So the fence cost me whatever, $1,200. And I now have somebody just getting ready, because I just built it, ready to pay me $230 a month, park an RV there, right? Nobody can see it. I don't care. It's fenced off. And so somebody's parking an RV in the back of a property and all I did was built a gate and a fence. Main house, the cash flow from the main house is about $250 to $300 a month. And this RV is this little bit of the yard, if you will, is cash flowing almost the same. It's eye-opening, right?
Yeah.
So you can also, if you've got a garage that you're not using, do you know how you can go to neighborhood.com, right, and rent your garage out for $250, $260 a month? Did you know that?
I mean, it's so easy, right? Like, you have more sophisticated things, right? Rolling a tiny house on, being able to build an ADU or various, which stands for additional dwelling units. It's just a separate little mini house you're talking about you rent out. Those are all things that are certainly going to add value. They're going to take longer. You may have to go through zoning. It's a little bit more sophisticated. It's going to take more money, right? But man, being able to just like rent your pool out, rent your garage out, let someone park their boat trailer in your side yard. How much effort does that take? Like, how much money does it take to put a $1,200 fence? And then you are getting 200. It's funny. It's like, I know we've got all these, we get lots of calls from people that are like, well, I want to get a certain cap rate, and if I put this much money in, I've got to hit this thing. David, what is the cap rate on spending $1,200 to being able to get $250 a month cash flow? I'd say that's a pretty good cap rate a pretty good cash on cash return, right? And all it does is require you to think a little bit differently and not just go with all the sheep, right? Oh, it's 8% interest rate. It's too hard to buy, David. I'm just going to go sit. It's not fair. You know, the government, this, the Fed, that, like that to me is where you're going to separate yourself right now, is being able to think again, think differently, looking at ways to monetize things, throwing up a fence. I have a buddy that had a big side yard, and he did the exact same thing with an RV, where I think he spent like $1,500 to get the 220, the power setup, so that people could keep they live in the RV, and he charges them like $1,000 a month to be able to keep his RV there, and he stays there, and he's there like a couple weeks out of the month, right? And as with most side yards, right? Who cares? The side yard, like no one goes in it, right? It's just there, right? We spend time in the front yard or we spend time in the backyard, and you got this awkward block of grass in the side that no one ever uses. No one goes around the side. Yet you can stick an RV there, spend $2,000 on electrical to get it set up, and then rent that out. And that is thinking differently, right? But let's talk about and then also too, I know things like just like, let's say you already have an Airbnb that's going. What if you put a hot tub in there, right? Maybe you don't have a pool, right? And you just put a hot tub, you know, and you spend a couple grand, whatever, maybe it's $4 or $5 on a nice hot tub. And now your vacancy rate went from, in this Airbnb bust period that you hear a lot of people talking about, going from 60% to 75%, and you're able to get more money. So you're able to get more bookings. You're able to make yourself more unique to your other competition, and you're able to rent it out for more. I mean, it's win-win.
I want to lean into that because average revenue for a property in a short-term rental world with a hot tub is 40% higher revenue. No, that's not gross or net. Like that is gross, I should say. But your actual revenue is 40% higher if you have a $4,000 hot tub in there. And also, I know some long-term landlords now, when they own nicer homes and they renew, they're putting a hot tub into the nicer home for a long-term rental. The long-term rental is renting faster, and it's renting for considerably more, because the renters who want a private hot tub will pay you an extra $300, $400, $500 a month for a hot tub in a long-term rental, and that's something that people don't think about, and I see that all the time. So if you have a property, it's in a nice neighborhood, it's coming up for renewal, consider putting a hot tub in there, and you'd say, okay, well, the average rent in this neighborhood is 28. Guess what? It could be 34, 35 if you provide a hot tub. So that is, look, we're just giving you a whole list of things that you can do now to drive additional cash flow in the assets and the inventory that you own now. Like Clark said, they're not easy. They require that you think again, require that you do something, get creative. But also, you don't make any more money. You don't get wealthier. You don't get wealthy by this cash flow. Cash flow liberates you from the day-to-day worries of work, let's say. But you don't get wealthy by driving this extra cash flow. People say, oh, what's this piddly 240 here, 240 there? Because cumulatively, you know, if your expenses are 13 or 14,000 a month or 15,000, whatever they are, the goal is twofold. Number one, cover your expenses so that you don't have to go to work anymore. And number two, to have a portfolio that's always growing your wealth. So it's a two-pronged strategy, right? So we just talked about how to think again and drive more income. Now, little section about expenses. Property manager, you've been with him for a long time. Go ask him, look, I've been with you for a long time. So look for, better tenants and higher rent. We talked about how you can do that, right? If you want to drive cash flow, you've got to invest in the property. Don't become a slumlord. We just did an episode about that. Invest in the property, you'll get higher rents, you'll get better quality tenants. If your properties are in the neighborhood and they're near you, consider self-managing one or two. If you've got a few extra hours on your hand, believe me, I self-manage a few of my properties. It's no hassle whatsoever. I've got a good handyman, I've got a good cleaner, right? And so consider self-managing when you have properties that are maybe somewhere near your properties, right? Big one when it comes to rent renewal time. You know, you hear about rents being softening or this, that, or the other. They are, but not really, right? If your tenant's living in a house, been there for 4 years, and the market rent for that property is $2,000 a month, and your tenant is paying $1,500 a month, it is time to have that conversation with your tenant. There's extra cash flow, very low hanging fruit. Your expenses have increased, your insurance has increased, your property taxes have increased. You need to, make sure that you keep your tenants on actual monthly rents for your neighborhood. Don't be cutting deals. You got to become a slumlord if you do. So always, that could be $350, $400, $500 you're leaving on the table every single month. So with your existing properties, very much look at your expenses. It's time to, tighten up your ship. And it's time to make sure that your properties are getting the maximum rent that they can. But what you're all waiting for is acquisition. How do I buy more property in a market with high interest rates? How do we continue to buy? Because here's for sure what's happening when you buy a CD. You're not really making all that much money. You're not going backwards. Well, you are maybe a little bit. By the time you pay taxes on that 5%, and you consider the impacts of inflation on your principal, you're just about treading water when you go out and you buy a CD with your capital, right? You're not making anything. And maybe that's the goal, right? You're not getting amortized payments every month. You're not getting tax deductions from a CD. You're not getting somebody paying off your mortgage from a CD. You're not getting capital appreciation from a CD. You're not getting depreciation from a CD. You're not getting mortgage interest relief from a CD. There is a lot of things that you're not getting from a CD. And this is in these little details of the things we just spoke about is actually where wealth is created. So if you need to continue buying real estate while you still can. And what I mean by that is probably for most people, they might get their first house when they're 30, but they might buy their last house when they're 65. And so that window, everything else has got to be right during that window. You got to have a job. You got to have a good economic environment where you feel positive about buying. You got to have access to down payments. You got to have, let's say, in this case, low interest rates, what you want. So the amount of windows that you have in that 30-year stretch of your life, you might only have a few different windows if you are the personality that's like, oh, I'm going to wait for this, wait for that. The people who get really wealthy are the people who consistently buy for 30 years, no matter what's going on, right? They just buy and they buy and they buy and they keep on going. So we promised you ways to drive cash flow. We've already covered how to drive cash flow with what you already have, how to trim your expenses and get higher cash flow by looking at your expenses of what you already have. But how do we get higher cash flow, Clark, on the buy side, on the acquisition side? So give me a few ways that we are today still buying and getting really nice cash flow on our deals at 8% interest rates.
Yeah, the elephant in the room, right? And I wanted to piggyback on one more thing on your expenses is that we talked earlier about the throwing the hot tub in, right? Saying, hey, if I put in a hot tub, will you spend some more money? I like sharing actual stories. I had a tenant in a property in St. Pete, and I wanted to go up by about $400 because I felt that's where the market rent was. And they said, they kind of waffled. They said, well, would you update the kitchen? And I said, you know what? Like, okay, cool. And so I ended up putting in new granite. I put in a nice backsplash. I think I put in like a stainless steel fridge or something and did a few things. It was probably $4 or $5 grand when it came down to it, right? Now I got an extra $400 a month. So that's $4,800 for the year. Great tenants. So it almost paid for it in the first year, right? So I basically had them put in new granite, make my asset nicer. They're happier. It shows I care. It shows as an owner that I care about their feelings. And they're like, hey, instead of me just moving the rent up and not doing anything, I reinvested it back into the property. So I'm still making about the same amount, but I just got a free kitchen upgrade, right?
Yeah,
and that is how you stay away from being a slumlord, because now And then guess what happened, David? About 6 months later, I went in for a big refinance. Okay. And guess what? The appraiser went in there, saw the really nice new kitchen, and it appraised for probably a lot more than the $5,000 I put into it. And
Yeah.
that's about thinking bigger. That's stepping back and looking at the bigger picture and not just getting stuck in the weeds saying, oh, well, if I put in an extra $5,000, then, I'm not the cash. I won't even start making any money until year two. And it's like, well, wait a second, though. That refinance, I was able to pull more money out, right? Tax free because of the fact that I was doing things like that. So I just wanted to add that in there as to pick up the phone on the renewal or have your property manager do it and say, hey, how much more money would you pay? Would you pay $400 more a month if we did X, if we did Y, if we put in a fence, if we, whatever it is about the tenant, maybe they want to have a fenced in backyard, they have kids or a dog or something like that. It's different things, different strokes for different folks, right? So let's hop into acquisitions. And I have another story too. So obviously you want to be able to buy things super deep, right? So the way to be able to get discounted properties is going to getting in wholesalers, getting on their list. Wholesaler is someone that puts a property under contract for X, and then they sell the rights to that contract for Y, and they make their middleman fee, right? And so usually you're going to get more distressed assets that way, which is how they're able to get them at a discount. Okay. You can look for foreclosures in your area. Okay. We're not giving you any breaking news in terms of being able to get things at discounts. And it takes a lot of sophistication to buy foreclosures. Okay. A lot of people think that you see something for foreclosure and then it goes to an auction. It actually takes a lot of expertise to do that. And you can screw yourself up if you don't. But being able to buy at auctions, being able to look for foreclosures for banks, things like that, direct to seller is going to be your best way. But you're going to have to put in marketing, right? You're going to have to spend some money on cold calling or sending mailers or spending money with Google on ads, things like that. So, but then you get to deal directly with the seller. Okay. You get to have a real discussion with them and you can cut out a lot of middleman fees in that. Now, there's creative ways, David, to be able to buy properties, to get them at a price where you might be able to cash flow. I'm going to give you an example that I had about 4 years ago. I bought a property where I offered the guy my cash price. I needed it at that discount. And he goes, Clark, I've got to go rent somewhere. He goes, I don't want to be a homeowner anymore. He goes, I just want to rent. He goes, where am I going to be able, his mortgage payment was $600. He goes, where am I going to be able to find a rental for $600? I thought to myself, and I'm like, I don't know, probably not anywhere, right? So I said, okay, that's cool. I get it. My cash offer doesn't fix your problem because then you have to go out into the world and rent a property for $600. It doesn't exist, right? It didn't exist 4 or 5 years ago, and it certainly doesn't exist today. I said, how about this? How about, you see that one-car garage back there? What if I convert that garage to a studio kind of apartment? I fence off a little backyard part of the area for you, and I'll give you a 1-year lease that I will renew every year for $600, but you have to sell me the house at my price, my cash price. And he goes, yeah, cool. And so we did just that. I bought the house from him, the price I needed it at. Okay. He lived in the front 2-bedroom, 1-bath house while I renovated the front or the back garage. And then I moved him in the studio. $600 a month. In Florida, you're only allowed to sign 1-year leases. So technically, at the end of that 1 year, I could have jacked the rent up. But I like to sleep at night. I like to be a man of my word. So I just kept it at $600. And then I renovated the front house. So then I essentially created a duplex. Okay. And guess what happened like 3 or 4 years later? He got tired of living in that studio and he moved to wherever he moved to. And the rent went from 600 to it's now about 1250. Okay. So being creative, understanding that people have a problem, they have to go somewhere else. Can you solve that problem by converting something in the property to be able to have them live in that? Yeah, it may not be ideal, but now they're getting a big chunk of money, right? And they're not having to go out and pay these super high rental rates, right? It's just an idea. So that's being creative, again, thinking outside the box, looking at things from a different angle, and also giving a shit about the other person on the other side of the table and what their needs are, which is so, so important, and not just looking at it through your eyes, right? There's other opportunities, David, too, and we can do a whole episode on kind of creative financing where you take over someone else's mortgage at 2 or 3 or 4%, whatever that looks like. The payments are going to be low. Maybe even having the seller hold like a second silent, what they call it, a silent second, where their equity that's in the property, they put it as a second position lien on the property. So you can do that to structure the payments so that you can create cash flow. So there are times where whenever I make offers, I'm like, well, how much do I want to cash flow on this property, David? Let's say I want to cash flow $400, right? And then I just basically look at the rent. I subtract out my expenses. I subtract out the cash flow I want to create for our company. And then whatever's left is what I'm willing to offer the seller as a monthly payment. So you can do things like that to be creative, convert garages, talk to the seller, figure out what their problem is. Is there some way to be able to move the chess pieces around the board to help them? And then in turn, they can help you by giving you a much better price, or maybe you take over their mortgage, which they put very to probably zero value on. Because once they sell it, it's gone. So they don't care, but you care, right? Because I want 4%, not 8%. There's things like you can buy bigger homes, 4 or 5 bedrooms. You can do things like we talked about before by renting by the room. Look for some really cool feature. Or you buy a lake, or you buy downtown, or you there somewhere that's something that is unique that will bring people as to your property as kind of like a destination, right? Are you close to a VA hospital? One of the cool things that we're seeing now, David, is not like you look at a house and you've got a nice big backyard. 99.9% of realtors are going to say perfect size for a pool, right? Of course. Now what we're starting to see is people putting in pickleball courts. I've spent more time playing pickleball in the last 6 months than I have in my entire life. And I don't even know how long the sport has existed, but people are putting in pickleball courts so that, friends and family can come stay the weekend there, have their pickleball fun for the entire weekend. It's exclusive. It's just them. And that's a destination. That's a unique feature. Okay. So there's all kinds of things that you can do that we've kind of talked about. So if someone says to me, David, I'm not buying right now, interest rates are too high, I can't make any money, I say, look, you're being lazy. And you need to be able to listen to this episode, because we've dropped about 15 things that you can do. Maybe not all of them relate to where you live or maybe your geographic area that you're located, but there are ways to be able to do things. But you got to think outside the box. You're not gonna get these things by watching Netflix on a Saturday afternoon, right? You got to be able to think different. So I'll leave it at that, David. Wrap us up. Tell us kind of your conclusion, your thoughts. We've spent an hour talking about these things. People need some takeaways to be able to go out and take action right now. So what should they be doing, David?
Yeah. It's my conclusion is you need to be doing all three here. You need to be looking at what you currently have and maximizing everything that you've got. It can be very powerful. You can completely liberate yourself. Let's say you've got cash flow of $7,000 a month from your portfolio. If you think again, you could actually have cash flow of $16,000 without buying a single thing. That's new. I've seen it all the time. Look at your expenses, make sure your rents are up to date, and negotiate. Don't be afraid to do that. And on the acquisition side, make sure you continue to buy real estate. You do not know what's going to happen when interest rates go up again, or go down again. Continue to buy deep, buy from wholesalers, buy from the foreclosure market. Learn about sub 2, because like you say, the seller doesn't value this thing. So pick up the phone. Don't be afraid. That's the most important thing. Pick up the phone and talk to the seller and find out what the seller wants. And so you might find out that the seller actually has a 2.5%, 15-year fix that they couldn't give a hoot about, that they're 7 years into, 7 years left. And you might say, okay, well, if I give you $100,000, can I take over that 2.25% loan? It's like, yeah, sure. I don't value it. Boom. Now you're putting down $150,000 or $100,000 or $20,000, whatever it might be. And you're getting a 2.5% loan out of nowhere, thin air. Now you cash flow like gangbusters, right? Amazing that you can do that. So sub 2, use seller finance. Look for value that other buyers are they're not seeing. Double lots, so you can swipe out one of the lots and sell it. Larger backyards, additional buildings on the property, somewhere you can put a pool. Like, just think more creatively. It is really powerful. Don't dismiss this, right? So look for, a property that has an in-law suite. Boom, a second unit that you can rent out. Look for tourism interest. Is there something that, and it's not one thing. It's like, oh, I'm only going to do, it's all of these things. And as you get more sophisticated, and you can put all of these things together. You know what? It's fun. 2024, we're not going to accept that you can't get cash flow. Interest rates are high. We've just given you a whole hour of counter argument to that. So with that being said, Clark, let's sign us out. Please, if you like this content, rate us, usual jazz, like us at least. Send at contact@burnyourboatswealth.com. Please send us an email. Tell us what you hate about it. Tell us what you like about it. Tell us if there's something that you think you'd like us to talk about that we haven't touched on yet. We've got some great guests coming on the show. With that, I'm done. I'm out. Clark, anything left?
I'll keep it short and sweet, guys. That no excuses. There are plenty of avenues out there to take action. If you're sitting around, a happy hour with your friends and everyone's, I can't buy a house, this, that, you're probably in the wrong room. So you may want to question who you're even spending your time with as a whole, because there's plenty of people out there that are thinking differently. Right. You need to get in a different room. You need to take action right now, and don't feel sorry for yourself, because the two people on this call don't feel sorry for you, and you shouldn't feel sorry for yourself. And we appreciate your listening. Come subscribe to us, and we'll see you next time, guys. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to the Burn Your Boats podcast with Clark Lunt and David Shaw. We would love to hear from you. Please reach out at burnyourboatswealth.com with comments, questions, and if you have a topic you would like Clark and David to discuss on an upcoming episode. We would very much appreciate it if you took the time to rate and review Burn Your Boats podcast on your favorite podcast listening app, and make sure to follow and share on social media. Content in Burn Your Boats podcast is for entertainment purposes only and is not legal or financial advice. Please review our legal disclaimer at burnyourboatswealth.com. Thank you for listening.